Let us do a quick review of wholesaling basics, because for those of you who are in the Deal Slicer community, you know that the name of the game that we're playing is wholesaling. Specifically, we're looking to buy from a seller at one price or under one set of terms, sell to an investor for a different price and or set of terms, and then collect the spread between those two prices or terms in a way that benefits us as investors. And so we collect, in some cases, cash, in some cases, cash plus cash flow as a result of that spread. So let's be really, really specific about what we're talking about here. Let's start with the who's who of a wholesale transaction. In a wholesale transaction, there are three major parties. There's a seller, we'll call them party A. There's us, the wholesaler, or party B. And there's the investor/buyer, party C. The seller is a person who currently owns the house until we buy it from them. They typically have a problem or a challenge that they're facing, and our job is to come in and help them address, resolve that problem, typically by buying their property. Property could be anything. It could be a single property, it could be a portfolio, it could be anything. But generally speaking, we are buying cash flowing assets. We're buying things that throw off cash flow. And we'll talk about in a little bit what that means. And then the investor buyer is someone who's going to buy from us. They are not owner occupants. They are investors that are buying for the purpose of making money. And they're typically going to be buying it from us so they can put a tenant in themselves and collect rent from that tenant. So we're not going to be collecting rent. We are, in some cases, going to be receiving money on a regular basis, but not as a landlord. And then we're going to try to find someone to buy from us who is not as good as we are at structuring deals, or perhaps doesn't have the skill that we have in terms of terms. But for whatever reason, this investor buyer sees fit to buy from us rather than trying to negotiate directly with a particular seller. So party A, party B, party C. What is a tired landlord? A tired landlord we're defining as pretty much what it sounds like. It's a landlord, someone who's got properties out for rent with tenants, and who has a very specific problem, namely that the tenant is no longer paying them rent. The landlord has filed what's called an eviction lawsuit to get the tenant out and to reclaim the property. And here we come to try to help that landlord solve their problem. Because as you can imagine, when the tenant stops paying them rent, that quote unquote asset that they had is no longer an asset, because they're no longer getting any rent, so they're no longer making them any money. And so it makes them wonder, well, why am I in this business in the first place if I'm not making any money? And our job is to help them go with that thought and perhaps sell that property to us. That's a tired landlord. How do we analyze rental properties? There are two primary things that we're looking for when we're talking about rental properties. We're looking at cash flow, and we're looking at cash and cash return. Cash flow is simply, think of it this way, it is the net cash that I'm going to get over the course of a year from a rental property, net of operating expenses, net of debt service, which might be loan payments, net of capital expenditures, net of all that stuff, but not net of income taxes, just net of all the property-related things. So property tax, insurance, vacancy, all those things are taken out. Whatever's left at the end of the year, that's my cash flow. And I'm looking for that to be ideally positive, and even better, hugely positive. And then cash on cash return is very simply a ratio of cash flow divided by all the cash that I had to invest into this deal to get that cash flow in year one. So it's the purchase price of the property, it's any closing costs that I incurred to close the transaction, and then any renovations that I had to do up front so that I could, keep tenants in or put tenants in and so forth. So my all-in cash is purchase price plus purchase price plus closing costs plus renovations. So cash flow divided by all in gives me my cash and cash return. It's expressed typically as a percentage. Higher is better. And typically in my world, good, actually great, is about 10%, which means you can think of it, for every dollar I put out, I get back a dime in that first year. Or I get a tenth of everything that I spend in cash back. That's what 10% cash and cash return means. Okay. How do we close the sale, specifically a wholesale transaction? The way we do it, the way I suggest that you consider doing it is, and I'll tell you what we don't do. I'm not a huge fan of assignment. I am a huge fan of double closing, which is to say there's a B to C, where party B is the wholesaler, remember? Party C is the investor buyer. There's a closing between me, the wholesaler, and that investor buyer. And then there's another closing between the seller and me. So there's two closings, an A to B and a B to C. And I do those two closings. And at the end of those two closings, there's money left over. And that money is what I get to keep as a wholesale fee. And that's how I make money as a wholesaler. So these are the basics of wholesaling. I just wanted everybody to be on the same page about how this whole thing works. If you have any questions, by all means, ask them. But these are the fundamentals that you'll need to understand.